Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Digital Ethnography Research Centre Seminar Brown Bag Series. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Ellie Rennie. I am acting DERC Director for a couple of months while 10 years away. And kind of by coincidence, but a lovely coincidence, we had contact with a scholar who I met in the Kimberley doing my own research at an organisation called Galari Media Enterprise, which is where Willie spent much of his time. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on here, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on unceded land. And I think I'd also actually like to acknowledge the Yaru people of Broome, which was the lands where we met. And I think, where we've both gained significant knowledge about Indigenous ways of seeing the world, and feel personally very privileged to have had that experience, which I'm sure you do it too. So William Lempert is a PhD candidate who has already done his defence of his PhD and making final changes, and his work is in the field of cultural anthropology at the University of Colorado, Boulder. His dissertation is Paleo Futures: The Social Life of Kimberley Aboriginal Media, and that's based on 28 months of work, as I mentioned, up there in the northwest of Australia. And during that time, he followed the social life cycles of dozens of film projects through daily collaboration with production teams to understand the stakes of Aboriginal self-representation embedded within the process of media making. And he will soon be starting as Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Bowden College this August, which is in Maine. So congratulations on that job. And please, I suppose in terms of how we're going to do this, Willie's going to speak for a while, and there'll be at least 15 minutes of questions at the end. We do have a roving mic, or you can press the button in front of you when you speak, just because we are recording this seminar. So thanks very much.
And thank you for that nice introduction. So I'm going to read a bit just to try to keep to time, so we do have time at the end. And I'll have some videos to keep it a bit interactive. And so we'll lower the light so you can see the media a bit better. My name is Willie Lempert, and I just started this job technically at the beginning of this month, so it's the first time of feeling like, I have the job and saying that in public, so that's exciting. I want to thank Melody and us. For organizing all the logistics, and I want to thank Sarah Pink and everyone else at DERC for having me talk and welcoming me in. So I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand, of course. I've been interested in Indigenous futures for over 8 years now, since working with Indigenous film festivals in Denver and New York City. Engaging with several filmmakers who were pioneering at the time an emerging form of native science fiction. For my PhD research, I returned to the Kimberley to collaborate with Aboriginal media organizations that I first started working with in 2006. This led up to my 2 years of primary fieldwork from 2014 through 16, and I'm now just coming back from 2 months in the Kimberley. I have my sort of backpack in the corner on the way, where I was sharing my dissertation draft and getting feedback for the final version of that document. And I'll submit this week. But throughout the projects that I was working on, an overarching focus has been on the relationship between Indigenous media production and the future. And so today's talk will be divided into 2 interconnected parts. In the first section, I will engage the emerging genre of Indigenous science fiction, emphasizing Native American filmmakers, while the second section broadens this discussion to engage larger contemporary Indigenous representational issues around sovereignty, justice, and the future, with an emphasis on the Australian context. So when most people in settler colonial states think of Indigenous people, they imagine an idealized past, a tragic history, and a troubled present. And today I want to engage a different topic with the less commonly posed question of what do their futures hold? And who represents those futures? So briefly, over the last 2 decades, there's been a marked increase in the number of Indigenous-produced films broadly defined, as well as their circulation through independent and Indigenous film festivals. In parallel, visual anthropologists have developed a scholarly literature around Indigenous media. And in just the last, decade or even more recently, some Native filmmakers have begun to draw explicitly on the science fiction genre in their work. And as has been explored in the very rich science fiction film studies literature more broadly, this genre uniquely positions filmmakers to imagine a variety of potential futures for their communities that meaningfully address present realities. I aim to further the development and application of analytical frameworks suited to understanding these critical works. And so one way that we collectively imagine the future is through science fiction films. They allow us to play out and discuss our deepest hopes and fears about the topics like technology, humanity, and climate change. The recent emergence of Indigenous-produced sci-fi films provides a rare common language for cross-cultural translation. By contrasting Western sci-fi with radically different themes around utopian sovereignty, dystopian assimilation, and non-colonial encounters of the third kind, we not only gain valuable insight into Indigenous perspectives on the future, but it also provides a cultural mirror for re-examining our own assumptions about the global challenges that we face as a community, nation, and species. Indeed, recently the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Science and Security Board moved the hands of their iconic doomsday clock 30 seconds closer to midnight. At just 2 minutes away, they estimate that we are closer to global disaster than any time in modern history since the 1953 hydrogen bomb tests. As the fate of the Western world looks increasingly opaque and potentially disastrous, in this talk I aim to illustrate that critically engaging alternative perspectives on the future has never been more important, and not just for Indigenous people. So like the concept of culture, science fiction is defined in a multitude of ways to suit different purposes. This concise definition by film scholar Richard Hodgins is perhaps most appropriate for this context, as it does not explicitly demand the inclusion of science, quote unquote, and focuses more broadly on either the future or the introduction of radical assumptions. To further develop an Indigenous futurist analytical framework, I draw on scholarly literatures in science fiction film studies, visual anthropology, and Indigenous studies. The term futurist has been used in science fiction studies for decades, and both feminist and Afrofuturisms have been developed specifically in relation to issues of marginalization, social critique, and the subversion of dominant ideologies. These provide models for an Indigenous futurist framework. I draw on Anishinaabe scholar Grace Dillon's explicitly plural Indigenous Futurisms, which she describes as the very discovering of how one is affected by colonization, discarding the emotional and psychological baggage carried from its impact, and recovering ancestral traditions in order to adapt. And she's speaking, about Indigenous people taking on this perspective, not others. And while drawing on feminist and Afrofuturisms, Indigenous Futurisms distinctively prioritize sovereignty from, rather than equitable inclusion within, settler states. Vitally important in creating such a framework is the application of critical work by Indigenous scholars, including Eileen Morton Robinson, Audra Simpson, and Linda Tuiwai-Smith. These scholars focus on the creative production of critical works that emphasize sovereignty, decolonization, and most importantly, the grounding of such work in contemporary Indigenous community issues. Also, in visual anthropology, scholars such as Faye Ginsberg, Eric Michaels, and Melinda Hinkson have developed a field addressing a variety of Indigenous media, particularly addressing filmmakers' ability to imagine cultural possibilities. This scholarship has also explored the relationship between these media and the anthropological tradition of ethnographic film. So to expand on Indigenous futurist frameworks, I will very briefly discuss what canonical Western science fiction films do in order to provide a point of departure for which to discuss what these recent Native science fiction films do. Then I will engage some of the important issues in the development of this framework. So science fiction films achieve many ends, but one that's important and relevant is They project anxieties and hopes for the future. Furthermore, while these films tend to be the brainchild of individuals, such as James Cameron pictured here, some are more culturally resonant than others. In attempting to engage films with broad popularity, I focus on films that have experienced immediate box office success and, more importantly, have demonstrated prominence in popular culture. Drawing on relevant film literature, I have organized canonical Hollywood science fiction films into 3 themes that I will later use to contrast with native science fiction films: colonization, self-destruction, and the utopia dystopia. So whether we're positioned as the defenders or the aggressors, virtually all science fiction films in which humans and extraterrestrials meet result in colonial encounters, usually motivated by resource extraction. As noted in the film literature, exceptions to this most commonly involve an individual alien trying to evade capture from human aggressors. These films are built on the assumption that not only would we subjugate aliens given the opportunity, but it naturalizes colonialism itself, by presuming that all intellectually advanced species would emulate aggressive and expansionist European colonial histories. Another dominant theme in Hollywood science fiction films is self-destruction. Such anxieties take on a variety of forms, including technological worries of computer sentience, biological manipulation gone wrong, or environmental collapse. So should we avoid aliens and self-destruction? It is unclear what our rapidly changing and technologically advancing human society would look like in the distant future. Utopian and dystopian science fiction films provide creative spaces in which to engage such potential futures. Furthermore, while the utopia and dystopia appear to oppose each other, they in fact represent a spectrum, as exemplified by something like Brave New World, which sits precariously in between the extremes of the relatively utopian Star Trek and the dystopian 1984. However, regardless of where films fall on this spectrum, they nearly always consist of homogenized worlds closely resembling white, US, Australian, or other European societies. And as for Indigenous representation in Hollywood science fiction, the same stereotypes exist here as in the vast majority of popular media. Essentialized conceptions of Native people as primitive, sexual, aggressive, noble, and exotic abound throughout the genre, often for the purposes of a white messiah escapist narrative such as Avatar. Furthermore, when aliens are presented as advanced and rational, they are again, almost without exception, visually and culturally white. It is within this context that I engage the genre of native science fiction film. Emerging in the last decade, they consist of mostly short films, with a few features and TV shows. They have been particularly supported by the Imaginative and Sundance film festivals in North America. These native science fiction films could be divided similarly into Western science fiction around general themes of alien encounters, utopias, and dystopias, though they also reimagine each of these subgenres. Indigenous science fiction alien encounters are particularly interesting in relation to Hollywood film, as they depict noncolonial interactions, focused on relationship and connection rather than aggression and colonization and alienation. Unlike the preponderance of Hollywood extraterrestrial films characterized by colonial aggression, Ojibwa filmmaker Lisa Jackson's The Visit depicts a nonviolent encounter of the third kind. In The Visit, a Cree family on an Aboriginal reserve in Saskatchewan, Canada, is visited by a flying saucer. While The Visit has an animated children's book style, the narrative embeds multiple subversive elements in contrast to its Hollywood counterparts, in which Grace Dillon notes, quote, "Either aliens invade humans or humans invade aliens." It presents extraterrestrials as being most interested in a First Nations reserve, as opposed to New York City, Paris, or another iconic metropolis. The trope that aliens would obviously choose such a city is itself founded upon the assumption that a technologically advanced species would be most similar to, and therefore interested in, urban Westerners who represent a zenith of humanity. In addition, the father's success in communicating through Cree cultural modes, especially in light of the ineffectual response of the policeman, challenges naturalized Eurocentric ideas regarding which societies are best positioned to serve as interplanetary cultural ambassadors. Since this short is under 3 minutes and words are a poor substitute for a film, I'd like to screen this now. There we go. The second theme is characterized by utopian futures defined primarily through sovereignty and an integration with traditional knowledge, rather than technology, homogeneity, and equality. Imagining both cultural and political futures, Navajo filmmaker Nanobah Becker's The Sixth World could be thought of as a utopian native science fiction film. In need of resources of the future Navajo Nation, a corporation and the U.S. government co-sponsored the first trip to start a base on Mars. When the GMO corn crops on the spaceship fail, the crew, consisting of a Navajo astronaut and her non-native colleague, are narrowly saved by germinating the protagonist's smuggled corn pollen used for healing and protection. This film may be viewed as representing a future beyond the colonial confines of nationhood and blood quantum. The Sixth World, which Becker notes is loosely based on a Navajo prophecy in relation to the current Fifth World. The Sixth World inverts and indigenizes colonial prophecies of Europeans as saviors. Becker explained to me that she chose to produce a sci-fi film because, quote, the genre lends itself particularly well to indigenous storytelling in relation to origin stories, the supernatural, and ubiquitous symbolism. However, while noting that her film aligns with the utopic sci-fi genre in many ways, she cautioned me against the simplistic application of utopia in any indigenous context, as it problematically implies a distinct sense of linear progression rather than cyclical time and the maintaining of balance. The Sixth World presents a future in which the Navajo Nation has increased its sovereignty, wealth, and influence in relation to the colonial aggressor. Such a historical role reversal is particularly powerful given the history of forced removal during the Long Walk, resource extraction, and uranium contamination, as well as the appropriation of the Navajo language for World War II military codes. Most importantly, while mastering interstellar technologies, these future Navajo people continue to take cultural values and traditions seriously while adapting them to changing circumstances, ultimately saving the mission, making the Sixth World possible, and enacting a cultural future. Here I'll play the final minute of this film just after the corn pollen has saved the mission. And to move on to utopian and dystopian sci-fi films, these provide particularly creative spaces for engaging potential futures as well. Frederick Jameson notes that these visions are not oppositional, and rather they both reflect a mix of hopes and fears regarding wildly uncertain futures. Thus, another theme that native science fiction filmmakers have explored addresses assimilation anxieties through the specific use of the dystopian narrative structure. In particular, I discuss Mi'kmaq filmmaker Jeff Barnaby's 2010 short, filed under Miscellaneous. Barnaby has received a great deal of critical acclaim for this and his earlier films, and has been characterized by one film critic as, quote, one of the most unique and compelling voices in all of Canadian cinema. File under Miscellaneous takes place in a dystopian metropolitan hellscape in the mode of Blade Runner, in which a Mi'kmaq man seeks out a surgical center in a dark alley in order to have his, quote, red skin gruesomely removed and replaced with white skin, after which he joins the 1985 Society. I will now show you just the final minute of this film to convey the vivid atmosphere and production values. This section begins just after the man's surgery is complete. As he prepares to enter the homogeneous society of disfigured pale men in suits, the character internally recites verbatim a poem written years before by Barnaby, from which he began conceptualizing this film. Having had his tongue cut out in the operation, this moment represents a crucial linguistic turning point in the film for the protagonist, in which, before the operation, he spoke in English and thought in Mi'kmaq. And as you will hear, he now thinks in English, though you can faintly hear Mi'kmaq in the background, slowly fading as the rising shot shows the larger cityscape. Science fiction film scholars have argued that dystopian films are not simply projections of the future, but also serve to critique present realities. Orwell's 1984 provided a commentary of Britain in 1948, at the beginning of the Cold War, that was concerned with the loss of individual liberty and identity, while Barnaby focuses his concerns on the loss of cultural identity and the specter of total assimilation. His film is informed by his own experiences moving to Montreal in his early 20s, after growing up with great hardship on the Micmac Reserve. Engaging these experiences through the lens of dystopic science fiction, he literalizes Frantz Fanon's metaphor of conception of white skin and black masks in terms of psychological colonization and the loss of language. Barnaby's dystopian future seems bleak indeed for Indigenous people. However, science fiction futures are not destiny, and the film serves not so much as a prediction, but rather as a cautionary warning of what may happen without community action in the present. It is important to emphasize the need for a plurality of Indigenous futurisms, with an overarching framework that is flexible enough to address particular community contexts and issues, as well as engage other Native science fiction media such as art, graphic novels, and literature. There are also a variety of cutting-edge media, including Second Life screen capture videos and virtual reality projects, including the VR documentary titled Future Dreaming, directed by Stuart Campbell, which follows 4 Aboriginal youth as they use virtual reality tools to prototype their future. And funding for this immersive media project was just announced by Screen Australia last week. And so I'll conclude this section with a discussion on the relationship between Indigenous science fiction films, such as Barnaby's, and the anthropological tradition of ethnographic film. Faye Ginsberg describes this relationship between these genres as complementary, providing mutually enriching perspectives for communicating cultural misunderstandings and understandings. Indeed, these films should be engaged by scholars not simply as creative fictions, but also as critical works. Furthermore, it is important to note that such media don't always have to be serious to engage serious topics, or to clearly fit into any of these science fiction subgenres. As an example, here I'll play a final 2-minute short from Star Blacks, one of the sketches from ABC's Black Comedy, which serves as a biting satire of Star Trek. Yeah, so as a final sort of just note on that, in the contemporary context in which Indigenous people face ever-increasing material and cultural challenges, the ability of Native science fiction filmmakers to imagine a multiplicity of potential futures while simultaneously addressing contemporary community issues ideally suits these films to contribute valuable insights to a variety of issues that we discussed. Science fiction has provided essential context for the larger development as well of Indigenous futurisms beyond science fiction. Drawing on many years of experience in the Kimberley region in Australia, I will now broaden this discussion trying to understand how the Indigenous Futurisms framework that was developed from the explicitly speculative Native science fiction canon can speak to larger issues of Indigenous sovereignty and justice. So I want to begin this larger discussion with one deceptively simple question. What happens when we center futurity in anthropological engagements with Indigenous representation and politics? I aim to illustrate the way in which Indigenous futures have been structurally silenced more broadly, and how the very representational tools of media, once used to temporarily trap them, are now being wielded to reimagine what Aboriginal people, Australians, and policymakers believe is possible, desirable, and inevitable for Indigenous people and communities. Since the early days of remote pirate media in the 1980s in Central Australia, Aboriginal video production has served as a primary means for providing alternative representations to the barrage of mainstream visual tropes. Over the last few decades, these productions have proliferated through a multitude of genres and platforms, now broadcasting on 2 national Indigenous television networks, NITV and ICTV. Paradoxically, this is aligned with the wide-scale defunding of Aboriginal services and organizations in recent years, policies undergirded by national imaginaries around the inevitability of assimilation. These imaginaries draw on the long-standing iconic status of Aboriginal people as having the world's oldest living societies, temporarily indexing them as anachronistic relics. While native title land rights indeed depend on demonstrating uninterrupted quote-unquote traditional cultural practices, long-term state relations and sovereignty will also hinge on the ability of Aboriginal people to articulate and amplify complex visions of the future within political and popular Australian imaginaries. Here I draw on my fieldwork, where I collaborated with the production teams of 2 Indigenous media organizations to understand the stakes of self-representation embedded within the social life cycles of over 30 film projects. In June of 2013, I arrived in the Aboriginal community of Balgo in the Great Sandy Desert. I was sent to assist with the Broome-based media organization Packham on a short film funded by NITV through the local Women's Center. We documented a week-long trip with dozens of elders and 11 Toyota Land Cruisers to the women's homeland south of Balgo. Mark Morris, seen here in the upper right corner, went along to guide the trip and be the film's storyteller. I would come to know and continue to work with Mark for years, including through the present. The following year, Packham was one of 10 organizations to receive funding for the inaugural and landmark Songlines on Screen program with the film titled Jawa Jawa, based similarly out of Balgo. And so after Jawa Jawa, I mentioned to Mark that we could make another film, or other films. He responded with, more dreaming and songline stories then. I replied it could be about anything at all. Anything, he asked, a bit surprised. Yeah, anything. So he thought for a moment and said, I'll have a rest and think about it. At daybreak, I saw him sitting in front of the community store in his cowboy hat smoking a cigarette. He smiled when I drove up and made a gesture that signaled, hey, I want to talk to you. I sat down next to him and he said, I had to think about it. Let's make a film about going back to country, about the future. Let's make the real film. Over the following months, we made regular trips south of Balgo, each usually lasting a few nights, and always accompanied by Mark's younger brother, Larry, as seen here on the left. During these trips, we would stop at the Yaga Yaga Outstation, a small community that Mark led before it closed a decade ago. It is here, near the sacred site of Mungai, that Mark envisions a home base for their future plans, integrating solar panels, satellite phones, websites, new media, camel tours of country, youth drug rehabilitation programs, acrylic painting, and tribal law. Mungai carries particular significance in this future imagining. When attacked by outsiders, Gugaja people would retreat to this hill, which would raise up into the sky and protect them from their enemies. Thus, Mungai is not simply calling Mark and his family home, but to a place of continued protection. This ongoing film project serves as a microcosm for the precarity of Aboriginal movements back to their country, where nightmares of the past, dreams for the future, and perpetual desires for one more bush trip coalesce into a film whose completion feels as urgent as its resolution seems unimaginable. So the lack of broad engagement with Indigenous futures, more broadly, is not merely an oversight, but I argue consists of a structured silence and structured absence. While Anishinaabe writer Leanne Simpson reminds us that colonial futures have long been dominant, Maori scholar Linda Tuiwai-Smith describes how time itself is captured in the imperial imagination, or what Mark Rifkin articulates as settler time. Since Indigenous people have positioned as the subhuman foil to Western modernity since contact, they are ever subsumed by binary language on temporality. Indeed, there is a long imaginative history of widely circulating colonial futures, imbued with Christian values, racial evolution, and territorial expansion. The future, like settler colonialism, was, as Bonita Lawrence and Inakshi Dua put it, quote, characterized by a persistent drive to supersede the conditions of its operation, that is, to make itself seem natural, without origin, without end, and inevitable. The future is now widely discussed and theorized in Native studies, especially in relation to sovereignty, queer studies, and science fiction in North America. However, I argue that part of the anthropological struggle to transcend savage and suffering slots relates to the limits of the collective ethnographic temporal imagination. There are, of course, a variety of notable exceptions, including Eric Michael's articulation of cultural futures through early Aboriginal video production. And in the history of Aboriginal futures, Faye Ginsberg and Fred Myers outlined this basic struggle that Aboriginal people continue to face in articulating their futures, while basic, quote, debates about the significance of an Indigenous presence in history continue to rage. Indeed, Aboriginal futures are not new. Discourses of continuity pre-existed contact and have long informed Aboriginal politics and creative production. What is new are these modes of mass circulation that are broadcasting these imaginings widely, as well as the development of language to theorize these cultural productions. In many ways, time is now the territory, and the relationship between time and space transcends metaphor. Rifkin's temporal sovereignty is a powerful way of articulating how time itself has been dispossessed by settler colonialism, representing a critical element in the process of decolonization. As with land, futures have been structurally dispossessed through settler colonialism and provide a framework for thinking through the structural qualities of temporal territory. As Indigenous research scholar Eileen Morton Robinson argues regarding the settler colonial process of, quote, becoming propertyless, so too does this logic involve Indigenous people becoming futureless. Temporal sovereignty thus provides an analytic for asserting future-oriented spaces in scholarly engagements with Indigenous people. It is also not enough to critique the ways in which Aboriginal futures have been structurally silenced. Centering the imperial imagination cedes too much temporal territory while also stoking the politics of purity. As Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o notes, the act of moving the center is perhaps the most effective political move. It is in the deliberate centering of Indigenous imaginaries through Grace Dillon's previously discussed Indigenous Futurisms that futurity's promise may be fully realized. As a model for how to do so, Jason Lewis, the director of the Initiative for Indigenous Futurisms at Concordia University in Canada, articulates the importance of the Indigenous future imaginary, invoking the productive refusal of imperial imaginaries that serve to depoliticize and emphasize radical difference. While it is essential that the constitution of temporality itself not be taken for granted, we should also be careful to, in that process, avoid reifying ontological boundaries. Rather, the focus should be on imaginative spaces that expand the landscape of Aboriginal futurity. The apocalypse serves as a crucial role in theorizing Indigenous futures. As Dillon points out, while the structure of colonization continues to manifest in the present, the zenith of its damage is in the past for many Indigenous people, with a huge asterisk, of course. Here, I articulate the importance of balancing generative hope with the post-apocalyptic present in the expansion of Indigenous Futurisms. To illustrate the post-apocalyptic present, I contrast it with its sci-fi cousin, the dystopian present. As discussed, dystopians represent tragic end stages in which victories have been rendered impossible. While serving as instructive morality plays and cautionary tales for audiences in both mainstream and native science fiction in films, the characters are resigned to an irredeemable world. Conversely, the post-apocalyptic present proceeds from a place of beginnings that does not foreclose future possibilities. This subtle but crucial distinction structures the nature of hope itself. In dystopias, the best that can be expected is something akin to Jonathan Lear's radical hope in the face of unstoppable cultural destruction, or even Lauren Berlant's cruel optimism, in which attachments to impossible goals become self-defeating and even harmful. On the other hand, what Tess Leah describes as, quote, bleeding heart idealism is also counterproductive, replicating missionary attitudes and implying a superiority over those being helped. What Athabascan American Indian Studies scholar Diane Millian articulates as a paradoxical double bind of Indigenous victimhood discourses. Ultimately, both dystopian and bleeding heart perspectives underwrite assimilation by playing into suffering slots of the present that limit futurity, fostering imaginaries of degenerative sociality for doomed and defeated victims. Alternately, in the production of Aboriginal media, many express what I have come to think of as generative hope. And this is hope with grit. It neither ignores colonial violence nor is paralyzed by it. By engaging in future imaginaries, generative hope engages what Aleutian scholar Eve Tuck calls for research that decenters damage in favor of desire, which is, quote, involved with the not yet and at times the not anymore. About longing, about a present that is enriched by both the past and the future. Together, generative hope and the post-apocalyptic present form a temporal dialectic whose perpetually unsettled terrain appropriately aligns with the paradoxical and erratic settler colonial realities in which Aboriginal people live. And I'm aware of the time, so I might sort of summarize a bit of what I wanted to say in lieu of making sure that we have time to have a chat. One thing I wanted to just mention, spending time in Redfern a little bit and the Tent Embassy. I noticed that a lot of this discussion related to what people talked about with treaties. And actually, Roxley Foley, we were having a discussion, and he knew Mark Mora, and something he mentioned about film is that Australians need to hear and see people like Mark. That is how we will have a future, by seeing it and by showing it, not by asking for it. So I thought that was a powerful statement. And just really the relationship between the future and terra nullius, and the way in which Crown law demands a certain type of treaty and future, but it's one that at a variety of ideological levels, they're highly motivated to silence, implicitly and explicitly. So to sort of run to the end, ultimately, voters and politicians make decisions largely based on what they imagine, or commonly do not imagine, is likely impossible for Aboriginal people in the future. As a friend of mine in Broome once said, who sat on the Oval, he didn't want his name shared, he would say, none of this matters if we can't create a better future. And I think that sort of sums it up. However, it's important to emphasize that Aboriginal futures are grounded in specific everyday local plans and country. For example, while helping me put together a tire in Balgo, a young man said, I'm thinking about the future. I have big plans. We just need a good truck and lots of tires and parts from other places. We just need a fair go. And I might leave it at that so we have time for questions, and I'm happy to talk about any of these things in some more depth. Thank you.
Hi. So my name is Susie Hutchings, and obviously I'm going to use a Western Desert term here, Djukapa. I just wondered how much that, the Djukapa itself, I know it possibly got another name in Balgo, but I just wondered how much that, in terms of it looks at the past, present and future and crosses it over, is and within the almost like a fifth dimension, how much that can be is a structure itself or a template for talking about how it could be used in film, because it seems to me that it's already there in the structure of Aboriginal religion in any case. So I just wondered if maybe you could comment on that. Chugaba, yeah.
That's something that I did write a bit about, and that's a great point. Something that I discussed further is that these futures are not sort of conceptual about progress and about disembodied ideas of things. They're always placed, in country. They're always about specific people in a place. And down the track is maybe even a better way of thinking about it than the future, which doesn't always translate as well. But I think that's right. And something that people would tell me often when asking about the future is they'd say that dreaming is about the future. It's about going back to country and waking it up. They would say it's not over. It's still happening. It's still down the track. So, yeah, I think that's right. And it's a tough kind of relation because it's easy to oversimplify, those types of concepts. But I think that's right. And that's why I've come to think of it as down the track in a lot of ways. And in a similar way as in acrylic art, all these media are about places and people ultimately, not about sort of the disembodied ideas. So integrated with everything in relation to what you said, I think that's right. And so a lot of it is about translating it visually into a way that is politically mobilized, for certain things. Because in the art market, there's a way in which it becomes kind of folded back into sort of a capitalist kind of agenda in some ways, among other things. Yeah.
The way of decolonising an enterprise using that format. So it's a form of sovereignty as it stands, I would suggest.
Yeah, I think that's right. And terms like visual sovereignty and temporal sovereignty, I think those are really useful. And then the trick with kind of using sovereignty in those ways, I think, is also making sure that it's always doesn't stand in for sort of sovereignty of country and land, but it is a sort of mode or inflection of it in certain ways. But I appreciate that comment. I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Willie. That was really interesting. With, I'd be interested, I suppose, to hear a little bit more about connection to country. I haven't looked a lot at these science fiction narratives.
Yeah.
But how connection to country reconciles or not with this kind of other world notion when place is so integral to the cosmology of Aboriginal law, etc. So I mean, how is that? Just what kind of narratives are you seeing in relation to place itself?
Yeah, great question. Well, even just taking these films. So The Visit, it's a story. It's sort of a family story about being in their house, in their home area, and visitors that they have. And it's just one more story of sort of clueless white fellas with paperwork and boxes that they're ticking. It's not really. The alien is not centered. It's sort of, we had a visitor and the white fellow was confused and we just did things the right way and had an interaction. File under Miscellaneous is about the inverse of that. It's about the disconnection from country and place, and how it's sort of a parable regarding that. So I think a lot of the dystopian films are ultimately about being taken out of place, and by extension land and family. And everything else. And the Sixth World is, they would use different language, but it's about Navajo country. The future is a Navajo prophecy about place and relates to the history of their migration. And it's not about Mars. It's not about sort of an Elon Musk, being drunk on the future and sort of technological expansion. It's about using corn pollen in appropriate ways to develop a community in the way that sort of elders have discussed that things will happen. Yeah. So I think when you take place out of these discussions, it becomes almost meaningless. Whereas there's a lot of Western ideas of the future don't involve place that much, if at all. I mean, the Martian or outer space whole ideology it's about a lot more than place. It's about frontier. It's about it's a moral colonialism from, as Elon Musk has said. So I could go on and on, but I think they're all about place and country in various translations of that, or the lack thereof. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks. That's a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. My question's a bit different because I guess in my work I'm interested in kind of using non-predictive ways of thinking about futures as a way to challenge the kind of capitalist innovation narratives of technological change and technological futures. And I guess what I'm interested in, what kind of resonance there is, I guess, in some of the futures you've been looking at with the idea of futures as being ongoingly emergent and non-predictive, non-determinate and those kinds of things, and how we can actually, I guess very typically, anthropologically, how we can actually learn from the way futures are being conceptualised in other contexts and other cultures to reflect back onto the way that futures are represented in the narratives of technological innovation. It's a hard question to answer completely, but that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, I think I understand your question. Sorry, the mic was going a little in and out. Is it about, would you mind, rephrasing it? Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So I'm interested in my own work in using non-predictive notions of futures and thinking of future as indeterminate and ongoingly constituted and changing, not being out there, as it is in many of the science fiction narratives, but it's actually something that's so uncertain that we can't really. We think we might know what's going to happen next to a certain extent, and that's why we can move on into the next stage, but we can't actually really know.
Yeah.
and using some of those ideas to rethink some of the narratives of technological change that are part of the innovation narratives of contemporary society, and which also drive all of those bureaucratic processes and audit cultures, etc. So I suppose my question is, what can we learn from Indigenous narratives about futures that can actually kind of help to, that would be coherent with that kind of way of contesting those predictive futures that are out there in 10, 20, whatever years' time, that predict that our world will be changed by technology. That we won't be doing much in relation to that ourselves. We'll just be changed by it as well.
It's a great question. One thing that comes to mind, and something Grace Dillon talks a lot about, is them being explicitly plural, that there is no future, that has no meaning, but there's just sort of endless potentialities. And a lot of the way I'm thinking about it, its constitutive nature is the key component. It's not about at a place of arrival. It's about sort of what thinking about the future can do. You can't have a future you don't imagine, and not that the future you imagine will happen, but if you don't imagine it, it can't happen. And so I think when we were just having this discussion today, that Western futures, it's often a very binary, you can almost draw a chart. Is it going to go good or bad? And there's a sort of assumption that people share roughly what that good or bad means. But I think in thinking about Indigenous Futurisms, that model has no meaning. And it's not arriving at some transcendent linear sort of zenith. It's about family and place, or it's not about anything. And what's interesting to me is that the utopian sort of white fella or Western futures are often the dystopian Indigenous futures, and vice versa. And so the idea that there is one homogeneous future is the ultimate dystopia, in a way. But I think I often think about, I like what Elizabeth Pavanelli writes about as the sort of otherwise. So I think kind of forestalling the desire to want to predict or know what the future is, and rather to imagine it as something that isn't already known and doesn't have to be already known, and that's not what the future discussion is about, getting it right, like the stock market or something. But it's about the sort of space that's opened up by thinking about futures for people who have been silenced. And just one example is, it would seem like there's a lot of diversity in science fiction, but if you look at all the films, including extraterrestrials, it's got to be less than 0.1% films that don't involve a colonial engagement. And so I think it's one example of how it can, reframe, all the assumptions that we imagine in these predictive futures. And to give another very quick aside, I was involved in, do you all know what SETI is? It's the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. So I was involved in a working group along with Kim Tallbear and some other great people. They wanted to bring people in, and this is at Berkeley just a couple months ago. It was called Making Contact, and they wanted different points of view on how to write working papers on how we should engage other species or beings if we should encounter them. And our ultimate discussion was, well, your question is, how should we engage them? And our recommendation is, you should think about, should you engage them? And if you look in the past, has it ever gone well? What's the evidence that it would go well? And that kind of didn't compute. And so there was this sort of fundamental block of, that point of view is hard to integrate because it seems radical as much as it's very, very much a simple point. And the other thing was just having a sort of, like the rights of indigenous peoples, the rights of non-earthling beings. And it was interesting at this sort of intersection that there was a lot of interest, but it was often not even objection, but almost like it was incommensurate. It was hard for them to hear the things that were being said. So I think that there's, creating that connection is, I think it's a fertile area, but it can be very tricky because you're often talking about totally different modes, from different ideological assumptions. But anyways, I might leave it at that. Thanks for that comment. It's something I'll think more about. Yeah.
I think that might be all we have time for today. Would you all please join me in thanking Willie for a very amazing, interesting talk?
Thanks. Thank you.